All right, so joining us now, we're gonna shift gears a little bit. I'm gonna bring in a progressive podcaster, or at least he started out as a progressive podcaster. Jamie Kilstein, host of the Jamie Kilstein podcast. He's also a stand-up comedian and a writer. Jamie, thanks for joining us.
Oh man, when you said progressive podcaster, I was like, and now everyone's gonna turn off their TVs.
No. We've been talking about the censorship and even some of the violence that has been coming the way of conservatives. And it's amazing to me how we say we'd like to debate, we'd like to discuss, we'd like to have these civil conversations. And then when we show up, we get people who want to scream and yell and kick and blow air horns in our faces. But you're the kind of guy, that's exactly what you want to do. You have a podcast, you like to call people out, you like to have conversations and friendly debates with conservatives.
Yeah, I mean, once liberals, I think part of it is this Trump derangement syndrome, where we've just all gone kind of like haywire and broken since the election. But I think that it is a better world to live in when you are not calling every conservative a Nazi. I mean, I used to live in a world and was surrounded by people where anyone who disagreed with me politically, I just assumed was a terrible person. And it was really me that was being a hypocrite. It was me that was calling out strangers on the internet instead of actually helping people. And now I have these amazing conservatives and who are friends of mine. And I get conservatives who write into the podcast who will teach me something maybe I never thought about with like gun control, but also say something, you know, where they'll be like, well, I'm actually kind of liberal on like gay rights issues or whatever. And I'm finding out that you can actually come up with solutions if you're not just pelting people with milkshakes, and that most of us have the same values. Conservatives and liberals want what's best for their family. They don't, you know, conservatives don't want the earth to blow up because of climate change. You guys don't want unnecessary wars. Maybe it's for different reasons, but most of us are decent human beings. And when you can go outside and get off Twitter thinking that, you're gonna have a better day.
You know, I'm old enough to remember Bush derangement syndrome, and Trump derangement syndrome has really kind of brought people out in a frenzy. Where in the comedy world? Because, you know, we expect lampooning, right? We expect the late night comedy shows and Saturday Night Live and Comedy Central to lampoon the ridiculousness of politics, but it has gone way farther than the way they treated George Bush. It's not just Donald Trump. It's anyone who voted for Donald Trump is just a horrible person who's ignorant, narrow-minded, racist, sexist, homophobic, bigoted, irredeemable, and all of this stuff. But this is really coming from the comedy world, and it's unapologetic.
Yeah. So two things on that. Before the comedy question, I actually had this really wonderful experience last weekend where I went to Texas to meet my girlfriend's family for the first time. And they're conservative and religious. And 10 years ago, I would have gone in ready for a fight. And all I really knew about her parents before going in was that they loved the woman I love unconditionally. And when I went in there not thinking about politics and just thinking about them as human beings who love the same person that I love, dude, they were the most wonderful people I've met in my life. And guess what? When I went in thinking that way, we ended up talking about politics, which you should not do when you meet your girlfriend's parents. Anyone else, I do not advise this. But we talked about guns, we talked about religion, we talked about homophobia, and we agreed on almost everything. And when we didn't agree, it was fine because we liked each other. So that just reminded me of that. But with the comedy world, I agree. I've always, you know, when I went after George Bush as a comedian, that's when I was starting to get big. It was actually kind of, you weren't supposed to do it.
But wait, let me jump in. Let me jump in. There's a difference. I think there's a difference between harsh comedy, right? And that's a component of free speech. And then when people in the comedy world genuinely hate the subject of their jokes. And there's a difference. And, you know, you can look at guys like Dana Carvey. He lampoons politics. You look at the elder statesmen of late night comedy back in the day. But somewhere along the way, some of these comedians went from the rough trade of saying uncomfortable things about people in politics to sensing that they genuinely hate the subject of their jokes.
You know what's sad, though? I think you're giving them too much credit.
Oh, wow. All right.
Because I feel like the difference between like Bill Hicks or George Carlin or when comics used to go after Bush is now it just feels like everyone is going after Trump because it is a legal requirement in order to be a stand-up comedian. So a lot of these jokes are just coming off as disingenuous. When I was going after Bush, and I got in a lot of trouble for going after Obama. I went on Conan and went after Obama, and I got in an equal amount of trouble. I went after him from the left. But now I feel like it's just a quota. When I was going after Bush, I was labeled a political comedian. And I really only had 2 or 3 jokes about George Bush. I talked about social issues. Nowadays, any comedian, from cartoon writers to alternative comics to club comics, it's like you are required to make Trump jokes. And I'm not a huge fan of Donald Trump, but I'm not going to make a Trump joke just because at this point it's hacky.
Yeah.
It's just generic. It's what everyone's doing. And they're so just easy jokes about the way he looks or about it's as shallow as we criticized people who went after Obama.
All right, so let's talk about censorship real quick, and we'll wrap with this.
Yeah.
You see an effort across tech platforms, in comedy. There's really, if you tried to, maybe somewhere there'd be a comedy club that would put up a comedian who's pro-Trump, and I'm sure there's someone out there. But there's really this effort to kind of push people off the debate stage. And I said in my monologue, if you're as smart as you think you are, if you're as funny as you think you are, you shouldn't need to push comedians out of the space. You shouldn't need to push people off of social media. Yeah. You shouldn't need to drown them out with a bullhorn. If what you stand for is right and you're principled and you've got your facts straight, you should not have to descend into kind of wanting to remove people from the space of whatever space we're talking about. But that seems to be the thing now. Get them out of here.
I mean, yeah, besides, Tipper Gore and that whole, I don't get rap music phase back in the Clinton days, the left, one of the reasons I was on the left is because we always thought that censorship is what right-wing fascists did. And now we are doing it. We are trying to cancel people for 10-year-old tweets. Look, here's how I feel is you have the right to say whatever you want. I also have the right to call you out. So if I want to say what Steven Crowder said was homophobic, I can say that. But man, I don't want him censored by any means. I want to have a conversation with him. Because one, if you're liberal, we're already starting to see there have been, because of this YouTube algorithm, there have been liberal journalists who have covered white supremacism, who have been demonetized from YouTube because it's all based on an algorithm. So when you're censoring people, creepy enough, right? When you're censoring people based on an AI algorithm, that's like Black Mirror level. We don't want that. So liberals shouldn't want that anyway. I think right now the biggest problem is because of Twitter, because of the political climate we're in, nobody thinks about principles or values. They just think about their team. So they're going to defend their team no matter what. And if their team is advocating censorship because their team doesn't like this person, then that's what they're going to do. But then when censorship comes for them, they're going to have to blindly defend their team. And no one is actually talking about issues. I want Ben Shapiro to go to college campuses. And then I want those kids to, if they disagree with him, to get smarter, to learn how to disagree with someone, to learn how to hear someone they disagree with and debate them like we used to do. I mean, we used to have Gore Vidal and William Buckley debate each other and call each other horrible names. And this was televised and this was important. We want the most intelligent liberals and conservatives to rise to the top, to be able to talk to each other. I want to change my mind. I mean, changing your mind is so frowned upon nowadays, where you'll get called a flip-flopper. I think that's evolution. I think that's good. You know, it's not necessarily selling out if you're changing your mind for the right reasons. And man, like, don't we just want to live in a world where we don't wake up to yell at strangers on Twitter? Wouldn't it be better to find common ground with people? Like, I don't know why we're not all rooting for that. I think it's fear. I think it's ego. I think it's dopamine addiction from Twitter, from social media, from retweets. Every time I ask a friend of mine who has a big following, you know, hey, the podcast I used to do where I screamed at Republicans all day made a ton of money. And under Trump, it's a little harder to tell my agent I want to do a podcast about nuance and civil discourse. How do I get this podcast out to more people or make more money? All of them say you got to start fights on Twitter. You got to have people go after you. You got to be hated. And I'm just desperately, and just like you having me on this show, desperately trying to not do that. But it's almost harder to be civil nowadays than it is just to scream and yell about Trump and Russian agents and all that nonsense.
Well, I'll wrap with this thought. It used to be that you had to hear the argument before you can reject it. Now we're being told some arguments shouldn't even be made, you know, because they're essentially dirty. And what if we pollute people's minds with these evil thoughts? Well, that's exactly what free speech is there for. But I got to leave it there. Jamie Kilstein, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you, buddy.